In a stifling room in Berlin, a report was placed before Adolf Hitler. Cold numbers lined up in rows, no blood, no gunfire, yet carrying the weight of a bomb dropped on Germany itself. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, looked straight at the Führer and said, "My Führer, America has produced 96,000 aircraft in just 1 year." The room fell silent. A moment stretched into eternity. Then Hitler scoffed, dismissing it as an exaggeration, a trick, a fabrication. But the truth does not need belief to exist. Outside, the skies over Europe were filling with iron wings. Squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and thousands of other American aircraft were erasing the once terrifying advantage of the Luftwaffe. With each passing day, the truth Hitler denied revealed itself more clearly, in the form of massive waves of bombs raining down on Berlin, Hamburg, Munich. The question was not only, how could America produce such staggering numbers, but also, why could Germany, with all its advanced technology and iron discipline, not stop it? This was not just a story about airplanes. It was the story of an industrial race, where factories, workers, engineers, and assembly lines determined the fate of the world. A story of how a single number, seemingly dry and lifeless, could crush an empire. And it is also a bitter reminder to us all. In modern war, battlefield courage is not enough. The real decision lies in the cold numbers behind the front lines, numbers that can define the survival of an entire nation. So let us step into this journey of discovery, 96,000 American aircraft in 1944, the number that decided the Second World War. March 23, 1944. Amid the dust-covered ruins of Berlin's shattered buildings, the Office of Armaments and War Production Minister Albert Speer still carried the solemn air of a power structure slowly collapsing. On the polished mahogany desk lay a thin folder marked with chilling words. Geheim, nur für den Minister. Top secret. For the minister only. Speer, long accustomed to endless production reports, growth charts, and weapon statistics, did not expect that this particular file would contain information capable of shaking the last remaining faith of the Third Reich's leadership. He sat down, his eyes heavy after nights without rest. From the tall window, Speer looked out upon a dying Berlin. Columns of women, children, and elderly men in hard hats, clearing rubble with shovels and bare hands after the latest Allied bombing raids. The clang of hammers and the distant wail of air raid sirens reminded him that German skies were no longer safe. Against this grim backdrop, Speer opened the folder. The first pages were dry tables, aircraft numbers, production categories, quarterly estimates. The trained eye of an architect turned industrial minister skimmed over them until he stopped, frowning. One bold line leapt out. U.S. aircraft production in 1944, 96,000 units. Speer's brow furrowed. He set the file down, then picked up a magnifying glass to examine each figure, each decimal. At first, he was certain it must be a typographical error, or at least an inflated figure from faulty intelligence. But the deeper he read, the clearer it became. The numbers were no fantasy. They had been corroborated from multiple independent sources, reports from a Swedish businessman who had visited Ford's Willow Run plant, an article in Time magazine boasting of America's industrial might, even clandestine aerial photographs passed through neutral channels. All told the same story. Speer leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply. His mind drifted to tense meetings with Hitler just weeks before, when he had proudly reported that German industry would reach nearly 40,000 aircraft in 1944. That achievement had required extraordinary effort, standardizing designs, cutting bureaucracy, dispersing factories to avoid bombs, forcing workers into ever faster rhythms. From architect to organizer wizard, Speer had become the man Hitler and Goebbels hailed as a genius. He had once believed that through sheer organization, Germany might balance its lack of resources against the Allies' overwhelming strength. But the number, 96,000, sliced through every illusion like a blade. Germany, despite reforms and ruthless efficiency, could produce not even half of what America alone achieved, and that without counting Britain or the Soviet Union. He turned another page. Diplomatic telegrams from the Spanish envoy in Washington, describing shipments of U.S. aircraft arriving in Brazil merely for training purposes. Some months, America sent 500 trainer aircraft to South America, numbers Germany struggled to build over many months. Another report described Pratt & Whitney's plant in Connecticut, producing 1,000 aircraft engines per week, employing over 40,000 workers, 11,000 of them women. Speer closed the folder and rubbed his temples. Outside, Berlin lay under a gray sky, thin smoke still rising from bombed neighborhoods. He knew full well Germany could not hope to rebuild entire factories under such conditions, while the Americans could erect vast industrial complexes in mere months. In that moment, a quiet despair seeped into him. For 2 years, he had fought to do the impossible, increase weapon output under relentless bombing. He had once felt pride at tanks rolling off assembly lines, at artillery shells multiplying fivefold. But now, all seemed pitifully small, swallowed by the vast ocean of American industry. He recalled Hitler's words, "Wars are decided by willpower, not by production figures." As a technocrat, Speer disagreed. Yes, willpower mattered, but willpower could not turn iron into steel, faith into oil, or hope into trained pilots overnight. The pages before him were proof that war was not just spirit, but arithmetic. In the silent office, Speer asked himself, should he present these figures truthfully to Hitler? He already knew the answer. Every attempt to show such evidence was brushed aside as Jewish propaganda. Hitler had scolded him before for being too pessimistic, for allowing numbers to sow despair. Yet Speer also knew that in private, men like Galland and Milch understood. They whispered to him outside conferences. "We've already lost, haven't we?" And he no longer had the strength to deny it. The folder on his desk had become undeniable evidence. Germany, no matter how fiercely it fought, no longer had a path to victory. From the spring of 1944 onward, Speer understood that all his efforts could only prolong the death throes of a collapsing war machine. Outside, Berlin echoed with the creak of horse carts hauling rubble, the sudden shriek of an air raid siren heralding another wave of bombs. Speer sat motionless, his hand resting on the folder. He felt like an architect who had designed a grand palace, only to realize its foundations had long since rotted away. 96,000 aircraft, more than a statistic. It was the death sentence of the Third Reich. In the imagination of many German generals, building a heavy bomber was a painstaking task, requiring thousands of skilled workers, months of assembly, and endless testing. Indeed, in the Messerschmitt or Heinkel factories in Germany, even the production of a compact fighter like the Bf-109 consumed up to 4,000 man-hours. Every stage, from crafting wings and fuselage to installing engines and weapons, demanded the craftsmanship of metal workers, welders, and engineers. Aircraft production was regarded as a kind of mechanical art, where every drilled hole and welded seam was the product of experience and skill. That was why, when the first reports on the Willow Run plant landed on Speer's desk, he could hardly believe them. This was not a workshop in the traditional sense, but a colossal production machine, a kilometer-long assembly line built in just 1 year by the Ford Motor Company. Willow Run did not build cars like Detroit usually did. It built B-24 Liberator bombers, massive machines of war with 4 engines, weighing over 20 tons, capable of flying more than 3,000 kilometers while carrying tons of bombs. The Americans had transformed the airplane, once a symbol of artisanal craftsmanship, into an industrial mass product. In reconnaissance photos smuggled out of America via Sweden, Speer saw a chilling sight. Thousands of workers, most of them women and even teenagers, laboring along the line as if in an automobile plant. Instead of a few hundred skilled craftsmen, Willow Run employed over 40,000 workers. Instead of taking months to assemble, each completed B-24 rolled off the line in just 63 minutes, from the moment the frame entered production to the moment it taxied onto the runway. For Speer, these numbers struck like lightning. He recalled long nights spent debating with German engineers on how to cut the production time of a Bf-109 below 3,000 hours. Entire research programs, strict regulations, and his reforms had only shaved off a few percentage points. Yet across the Atlantic, the Americans had shattered every convention by applying Ford A.S. principles of mass production, something Europe admired but had never dared to attempt in aviation. What shook Speer most was not just the speed, but the scale. At its peak, Willow Run could produce one bomber per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a single day, it delivered more aircraft than a Messerschmitt factory could in an entire week. And Willow Run was not alone. There were dozens of other plants across the United States, Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in Fort Worth, North American in Los Angeles, all working at a frantic pace. Secret Swedish intelligence reports added even more chilling details. Many workers at Willow Run had never touched an airplane before, yet a few weeks of training sufficed for them to join the line. They didn't need to become craftsmen, because the work had been broken down into thousands of extremely simple tasks: tightening a bolt, placing a metal plate, pulling a welding lever. All of it flowed together like a perfectly orchestrated industrial symphony. Compared with Germany, the contrast was bitter. In Augsburg or Regensburg, Messerschmitt plants constantly suffered from shortages of skilled labor. Many workers had been drafted to the front, forcing Speer to rely on forced labor from concentration camps or foreign workers. These laborers lacked training, worked with low morale, and often made mistakes or engaged in sabotage, dragging productivity down. Meanwhile, in America, workers came from technical schools, were well-paid, well-fed, and operated in safe conditions. Willow Run was not just a factory, it was a symbol of American might. The Western press called it the arsenal of democracy. For Germans, the name alone was terrifying. The Luftwaffe, once supreme in the skies of Europe in 1940, now faced an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. Another number in the reports deepened Speer's despair. In 1943, the United States produced over 8,000 B-24s from Willow Run, and its satellite plants alone equal to the entire German bomber output that year. And in 1944, America aimed to double that. Speer instantly grasped the strategic implications. If America could sustain such relentless production, then every air defense plan, every calculation of enemy attrition became meaningless. The Luftwaffe could shoot down 10, 20, even 50 bombers in a day, yet the next day America had already replaced them twice over. It was an unstoppable cycle, a torrent of industrial power that Germany could not possibly stem. In meetings with Hitler, Speer occasionally mentioned Willow Run, but received only irritated frowns in return. Hitler dismissed the reports as exaggerations, claiming Americans were braggarts. He believed that miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, the Me-262 jet fighters, would be enough to change the war's course. But Speer, after poring over every page of the reports, knew the truth. No matter how fast the Me-262 flew, no matter how terrifying the V-2 was over London, it was like throwing stones into the ocean against an enemy capable of producing tens of thousands of planes and millions of tons of bombs every year. Willow Run was the death sentence of the Third Reich. It proved that war was no longer decided by a handful of military geniuses or a few technological breakthroughs, but by the power of mass production. The Americans had turned war into an industrial equation, and they possessed every variable: steel, oil, aluminum, rubber. Meanwhile, Germany scraped by on synthetic fuel and smuggled Swedish aluminum. For Speer, every thought of Willow Run evoked not just a factory in distant Michigan, but an entire system, a vast industrial web stretching from coast to coast, linked by railroads, highways, and deep-water ports. Willow Run was just one node, yet it revealed the chasm between two worlds, a fully industrialized democracy and a dictatorship running on fumes. When Speer finally laid the reports aside, all lingering illusions crumbled. He thought to himself, if they can build planes the way they build cars, then we have no hope left. In the imagination of many German generals, building a heavy bomber was a painstaking task, requiring thousands of skilled workers, months of assembly, and endless testing. Indeed, in the Messerschmitt or Heinkel factories in Germany, even the production of a compact fighter like the Bf-109 consumed up to 4,000 man-hours. Every stage, from crafting wings and fuselage to installing engines and weapons, demanded the craftsmanship of metal workers, welders, and engineers. Aircraft production was regarded as a kind of mechanical art, where every drilled hole and welded seam was the product of experience and skill. That was why, when the first reports on the Willow Run plant landed on Speer's desk, he could hardly believe them. This was not a workshop in the traditional sense, but a colossal production machine, a kilometer-long assembly line built in just 1 year by the Ford Motor Company. Willow Run did not build cars like Detroit usually did. It built B-24 Liberator bombers, massive machines of war with 4 engines, weighing over 20 tons, capable of flying more than 3,000 kilometers while carrying tons of bombs. The Americans had transformed the airplane, once a symbol of artisanal craftsmanship, into an industrial mass product. In reconnaissance photos smuggled out of America via Sweden, Speer saw a chilling sight. Thousands of workers, most of them women and even teenagers, laboring along the line as if in an automobile plant. Instead of a few hundred skilled craftsmen, Willow Run employed over 40,000 workers. Instead of taking months to assemble, each completed B-24 rolled off the line in just 63 minutes, from the moment the frame entered production to the moment it taxied onto the runway. For Speer, these numbers struck like lightning. He recalled long nights spent debating with German engineers on how to cut the production time of a Bf-109 below 3,000 hours. Entire research programs, strict regulations, and his reforms had only shaved off a few percentage points. Yet across the Atlantic, the Americans had shattered every convention by applying Ford's principles of mass production, something Europe admired but had never dared to attempt in aviation. What shook Speer most was not just the speed, but the scale. At its peak, Willow Run could produce 1 bomber per hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a single day, it delivered more aircraft than a Messerschmitt factory could in an entire week. And Willow Run was not alone. There were dozens of other plants across the United States, Boeing in Seattle, Consolidated in Fort Worth, North American in Los Angeles, all working at a frantic pace. Secret Swedish intelligence reports added even more chilling details. Many workers at Willow Run had never touched an airplane before. Yet a few weeks of training sufficed for them to join the line. They didn't need to become craftsmen, because the work had been broken down into thousands of extremely simple tasks. Tightening a bolt, placing a metal plate, pulling a welding lever. All of it flowed together like a perfectly orchestrated industrial symphony. Compared with Germany, the contrast was bitter. In Augsburg or Regensburg, Messerschmitt plants constantly suffered from shortages of skilled labor. Many workers had been drafted to the front, forcing Speer to rely on forced labor from concentration camps or foreign workers. These laborers lacked training, worked with low morale, and often made mistakes or engaged in sabotage, dragging productivity down. Meanwhile, in America, workers came from technical schools, were well paid, well fed, and operated in safe conditions. Willow Run was not just a factory, it was a symbol of American might. The Western press called it the arsenal of democracy. For Germans, the name alone was terrifying. The Luftwaffe, once supreme in the skies of Europe in 1940, now faced an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. Another number in the reports deepened Speer's despair. In 1943, the United States produced over 8,000 B-24s from Willow Run and its satellite plants alone, equal to the entire German bomber output that year. And in 1944, America aimed to double that. Speer instantly grasped the strategic implications. If America could sustain such relentless production, then every air defense plan, every calculation of enemy attrition, became meaningless. The Luftwaffe could shoot down 10, 20, even 50 bombers in a day. Yet the next day, America had already replaced them twice over. It was an unstoppable cycle, a torrent of industrial power that Germany could not possibly stem. In meetings with Hitler, Speer occasionally mentioned Willow Run, but received only irritated frowns in return. Hitler dismissed the reports as exaggerations, claiming Americans were braggarts. He believed that miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, the Me-262 jet fighters, would be enough to change the war's course. But Speer, after poring over every page of the reports, knew the truth. No matter how fast the Me-262 flew, no matter how terrifying the V-2 was over London, it was like throwing stones into the ocean against an enemy capable of producing tens of thousands of planes and millions of tons of bombs every year. Willow Run was the death sentence of the Third Reich. It proved that war was no longer decided by a handful of military geniuses or a few technological breakthroughs, but by the power of mass production. The Americans had turned war into an industrial equation, and they possessed every variable: steel, oil, aluminum, rubber. Meanwhile, Germany scraped by on synthetic fuel and smuggled Swedish aluminum. For Speer, every thought of Willow Run evoked not just a factory in distant Michigan, but an entire system, a vast industrial web stretching from coast to coast, linked by railroads, highways, and deep-water ports. Willow Run was just one node, yet it revealed the chasm between two worlds, a fully industrialized democracy and a dictatorship running on fumes. When Speer finally laid the reports aside, all lingering illusions crumbled. He thought to himself, if they can build planes the way they build cars, then we have no hope left. In the command bunker at Rastenburg, deep within the forests of East Prussia, the air was always thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps covered the table, pinned with tiny red, blue, and yellow flags marking the positions of German and Allied forces. At the center of the room sat Adolf Hitler, motionless, his eyes still blazing yet etched with the fatigue of a man who had lived too long inside an illusion. When Albert Speer entered with a new dossier in hand, he knew the coming meeting would be a battle, not on the battlefield but inside the dictator's mind. Speer spoke calmly, his voice steady but firm. Mein Führer, reports from multiple independent sources confirm that American aircraft production this year may reach 96,000 units. Factories such as Willow Run are producing B-24s at the rate of 1 per hour. If this continues, we cannot make up for our losses. He opened the map, pointing to figures, citing evidence from Swedish and Spanish intelligence, even verified photographs. Hitler, instead of listening, frowned and let out a derisive laugh. 96,000? Absurd. That is nothing but Jewish propaganda. The Americans have no fighting spirit, no discipline. They only know how to produce toys. Their airplanes are built by ignorant workers. We, the German people, understand what true engineering means. The room fell silent. Speer remained patient, but he saw clearly the eyes of the officers present. Galland, the fighter command chief, Milch, the inspector general of the Luftwaffe, Admiral Dönitz, head of the U-boat fleet. They said nothing, but in their dark, weary gazes lingered doubt. For they, more than anyone, faced the brutal reality at the front lines. American planes arriving in swarms, American warships patrolling without pause, Sherman tanks rolling across French soil. They did not need reports to know the enemy was growing stronger by the hour. Galland, The seasoned ace with hundreds of combat missions finally spoke with a hard edge. Mein Führer, each time we shoot down a squadron, the next day another arrives, twice as large. We lack pilots, we lack fuel. They do not. His words echoed in the room, but Hitler brushed them aside. You are too pessimistic, Galland. The Americans may have numbers, but they are nothing but soulless metal boxes. Fighting spirit decides the outcome, and in that, we are superior. Speer looked down at the file, his hand tightening. He knew reasoned arguments were useless. Hitler lived in a world of will and myth, where numbers meant nothing against his unshakable belief in the destiny of the German people. But Speer also knew that soldiers dying at the front could not be saved by slogans. After the meeting, as the others filed out, Galland leaned close to Speer and whispered, "You see it. We are not only losing in the skies, but also inside the Führer's mind." Milch, his face heavy with resignation, muttered, "Our Air Force cannot recover. The Americans train pilots faster than we can build planes." Even Admiral Donitz, usually steadfast and loyal, admitted, "The U-boat fleet has lost the initiative. For every ship we sink, America builds 10 more. They treat ships as if they were disposable. We cannot keep up." With each passing day, the gulf between Speer's reports and Hitler's convictions grew wider. In his memoirs, Speer later wrote, "I saw collapse taking shape within the heart of the regime itself. On one side stood the industrial reality of America, on the other, Hitler's stubborn denial. Between the two, truth was ground to dust." Subsequent meetings became ritual repeats. Speer presented figures. Hitler dismissed them. Speer spoke of fuel shortages. Hitler declared synthetic oil would save the Reich. Speer warned of undertrained pilots. Hitler claimed national spirit would compensate. Again and again, Speer felt as if he were talking to a wall. Meanwhile, the generals began holding private conversations among themselves. Galland admitted, "If American production truly reaches 96,000 planes, then the Luftwaffe has no reason to exist." Milch only nodded in silence. Donitz, bitter, added, "We are fighting with daggers while the enemy wields cannons." The irony was that even as Hitler dismissed the figures, he was haunted by them. In his long monologues, he would often return to the number, "The Americans cannot possibly produce that many. If it were true, then Germany is already lost." And every time, anger flared, and he clung harder to promises of miracle weapons. Whenever Speer left those meetings, he felt as though he had witnessed a tragic play. He realized that not only Hitler, but the entire machinery of power around him depended on denial. To acknowledge America's industrial might was to admit the war was lost, and with that, the entire Reich would collapse into despair. For Speer, the greatest tragedy was not the numbers themselves, but the chasm between truth and lies. He had once believed that through organization and discipline, Germany could stand against the world. But now, as he looked into the tired faces of the generals, their disillusioned eyes, and heard Hitler's hollow declarations, he understood that the Third Reich had become a prisoner of its own illusions. In his memoirs, Speer wrote, "When I presented the figure of 96,000 American aircraft, Hitler did not deny it with reason, but with faith. This was no longer politics, no longer strategy, it was blind religion. And in that religion, truth had no place. The generals knew the truth, yet they were bound by loyalty and fear. Speer, too, was trapped. They all knew they were losing, but none dared to say it aloud. And so the war dragged on. Millions more dying to sustain an illusion already long since shattered. When Europe was still engulfed in flames, across the Atlantic, the United States seemed like another world. Their cities were not flattened by bombs, their bridges and roads were not cut off, their factories were not smashed by enemy aircraft. While in Berlin, Hamburg, or Essen, people had to live in air raid shelters. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, millions of workers entered their shifts with machines blazing through the night. That was the fundamental difference. The safety of their homeland allowed the United States to concentrate all its strength on production, without the distraction of fearing destruction. American power began with something seemingly simple: natural resources. On the world map, the U.S. possessed a continent that was almost entirely self-sufficient. From Texas oil, Appalachian coal, Minnesota iron ore, Pittsburgh steel, to synthetic rubber made from petroleum, everything was available within national borders. While Germany had to plunder from occupied lands, relying on Romanian oil, Swedish ore, or Southeast Asian rubber, Americans tapped directly into their own soil. That difference was the foundation. Next came technology and mass production techniques. Before the war, Detroit was already the automobile capital of the world. When war broke out, the same assembly lines that had once turned out Fords and Chevrolets were adapted to build planes, tanks, and trucks. Ford's Willow Run plant was the prime example. Stretching more than 1.5 kilometers with 40,000 workers, it rolled out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. No nation on Earth could match such efficiency. The U.S. also applied scientific management to production. Every part was standardized and easily replaceable. A damaged engine could be removed and swapped out within hours. By contrast, German aircraft, though sophisticated, were too complex for mass production, each requiring skilled craftsmen working painstakingly by hand. The result? When a P-51 Mustang was shot down, America replaced it in a day. When a Me-262 fell, the Luftwaffe needed months to build another. Another factor often overlooked, but one Speer understood well, was energy and fuel. Planes, tanks, and warships consumed fuel like water. In 1944, the U.S. produced over 200 million tons of oil, while Germany, even with Romanian oil and synthetic fuel technology, managed only about 12 million tons. This vast gap meant the Allies could fly more, train pilots longer, move faster, and never worry about running dry. Meanwhile, German pilots often trained for only a few hours before combat, simply because fuel was scarce. Beyond material wealth, America possessed a special weapon: abundant manpower. As millions of men joined the military, the industrial workforce was filled by women, African Americans, and immigrants, many entering factories for the first time. Rosie the Riveter, the image of a woman rolling up her sleeves before a machine, became an icon. While Germany relied on forced labor from concentration camps, oppressed, unwilling, and inefficient, the U.S. relied on volunteer spirit and pride, turning every worker into part of the war effort. Technology was another battlefield where America excelled. Radar enabled early detection of enemy aircraft. The proximity fuse transformed anti-aircraft guns into deadly weapons, downing German planes at unprecedented rates. Turbocharged engines allowed P-51 Mustangs to escort B-17s deep into German skies without faltering at high altitude. These inventions not only boosted firepower but also reduced training time and streamlined operations. America also dominated logistics. Thousands of Liberty ships were built in mere weeks, each carrying thousands of tons of weapons, food, and fuel across the Atlantic. Dönitz bitterly admitted, "We sink one ship, they build 10 more." It was an undeniable truth. The regenerative power of American industry was so great that every U-boat victory became meaningless. While Speer struggled to allocate each ton of steel among tanks, rifles, and planes, America produced all of them at once, and in staggering numbers. At peak, the U.S. built more than 7,000 planes, 5,000 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and hundreds of thousands of rifles each month. At the same time, they were launching carriers, destroyers, and submarines, a torrent of weapons Nazi Germany could never hope to rival. Speer once bitterly wrote, "The Americans do not need to choose. They do not ask whether to build tanks or planes, artillery or ships. They simply build everything at once in quantities many times greater than ours. Behind the figure of 96,000 planes in 1944 was a system that ran as smoothly as a giant machine. From engineering schools, steel mills, ports, to transcontinental railroads, all were linked into an unbreakable supply chain. A B-17 bomber could be assembled from tens of thousands of parts made across the country, wings in California, engines in Ohio, wheels in Michigan. Yet when brought together, they fit perfectly, as if the entire United States were one vast factory. Meanwhile, Germany, with brilliant engineers and advanced designs, could not overcome shortages of raw materials, lack of standardization, and above all, lack of time. A Me-262 jet might surpass anything in the sky, but each required thousands of hours of skilled labor, and once lost, it could not be replaced swiftly. This was the paradox Speer knew better than anyone. Germany could create miracle weapons, but America created an endless stream of weapons. And in modern war, that stream mattered more than any isolated invention. By 1944, as Speer looked at American production, he came to a bitter realization. Germany was not defeated for lack of will, but for lack of industry. Every strategy, every plan, every secret weapon became meaningless against an opponent with infinite production capacity. And so, when 96,000 American aircraft rolled off the assembly lines in a single year, those numbers were not mere statistics. They were the death sentence of the Third Reich, May 1945. The last gunshots on the European battlefield faded away. Berlin lay in ruins. The Führer had taken his own life in the bunker, and the Red Army's flag flew atop the Reichstag. At that moment, Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production of the Third Reich, sat alone in a shattered room, leafing through old reports. Amidst the scattered papers, his eyes fell again on the number that haunted him: 96,000 American aircraft in 1944. That number, more than any bomb, was Germany's death sentence. Speer remembered the meetings at Rastenburg and Berlin, where he had tried to persuade Hitler to accept the truth. He remembered Gallen's weary eyes, Dönitz's bitterness, and the Führer's furious denials. Those were not mere arguments. They were moments that sealed the fate of an entire nation, and each time truth was rejected, Germany moved one step closer to annihilation. What tormented Speer was not only the industrial gap, but the blindness of leadership. Hitler believed in absolute willpower, in spiritual strength, in the promise of miracle weapons that would turn the tide. But Speer knew better. He was the man who counted every ton of steel, every liter of fuel, every factory shift, that no willpower could replace steel and oil. No faith could conjure aircraft out of nothing. In 1944, while America produced 96,000 aircraft, Germany managed only about 39,000, the highest figure it would ever reach, despite desperate reforms, coercion, and sacrifice. But the gap was not in numbers alone. While American planes rolled off production lines and went straight into battle with fresh pilots, German aircraft often sat idle, grounded by shortages of fuel, spare parts, or pilots already lost in hopeless duels against overwhelming odds. Speer would later write in his memoirs, "We turned Germany into one vast construction site, but it was all meaningless. Even if we doubled our output, America alone produced 3 times as much. Add the Soviet Union, Britain, and the resources of their colonies, and this war was unwinnable from the start. We fought against the entire industrial world." In the final months, Speer wrestled with a crushing question. Should he speak the truth? If he openly declared that Germany had already lost by 1944, perhaps millions of lives might have been spared. But in Hitler's regime, truth was treason, and treason meant death. And so Speer remained silent, a silence that would weigh upon him for the rest of his life. From the perspective of history, Speer's tragedy was Germany's tragedy, a nation trapped between truth and delusion. They had brilliant engineers, tireless workers, inventions ahead of their time, yet all of it was subordinated to a leader who refused to face reality. When Hitler insisted that will can change reality, he turned an entire country into a hostage of illusion. 96,000 American aircraft was not just a number. It was the symbol of modern industrial power, a force that determined wars more decisively than dramatic battles. The Americans proved that World War II was decided not only at Normandy, Stalingrad, or Kursk, but also in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Willow Run. On the production lines, in the steel mills, in the radar labs, there true victory was forged. Speer once remarked, "Modern war is no longer a duel between military geniuses. It is a contest of production. Whoever produces more, faster, and more efficiently, that side will win. And in that contest, Germany never stood a chance against America." At the Nuremberg trials after the war, Speer was asked, "When did you realize Germany had lost?" He replied, "When I learned that America could produce 96,000 aircraft in a single year. From that moment, all our efforts were meaningless." The tragedy of Germany was that it continued fighting for another year and a half, millions more dead, hundreds of cities reduced to rubble, a continent in ruins, all because one man refused to believe the obvious. For Speer, that number left a bitter lesson. Industry is strategy. A nation may have great generals, brave soldiers, and advanced weapons, but without a powerful industrial base to sustain war, all of it is an illusion. And in World War II, America proved that its industry was the greatest weapon of all. Today, historians often argue that the Second World War was in essence a clash between Germany's centralized, precision-focused industry and America's mass production machine. One side built exquisite, sophisticated, costly weapons. The other built simple, reliable arms in overwhelming numbers. In a prolonged war, mass production always wins. Speer had seen this truth as early as 1944, but he was powerless, trapped in the very system he had helped to build. That was the bitter irony. The only man in Hitler's inner circle who understood the laws of industry could not alter his nation's fate. In the end, the figure of 96,000 American aircraft in 1944 became more than a statistic. It was the symbol of America's strength and the marker of the end of Hitler's dream of domination. It proved that in the age of modern warfare, not willpower, not military genius, but industry, factories, assembly lines, and resources was the ultimate arbiter of survival. Albert Speer survived the war, but he never escaped the shadow of that number. It followed him to his last days, a reminder that some truths, however self-evident, can still be denied, and the price of that denial can be the collapse of an entire empire. There are numbers that transcend statistics. They are not just data, but symbols, verdicts, mirrors of an entire age. 96,000 American aircraft in 1944 was such a number. It did not merely reflect the vast productive capacity of the United States. It told the story of how war was decided not only by generals on the battlefield, but by workers in factories, engineers in laboratories, and assembly lines that never went dark. Albert Speer understood this, but far too late. When he presented the figures to Hitler, when he warned of America's industrial supremacy, he was not speaking only of airplanes. He was speaking of an entire social system, one capable of mobilizing every resource, from natural wealth to human intellect, to create overwhelming power. And Nazi Germany, with all its brutality, discipline, and technical brilliance, could not bridge that gap. The first lesson of this story is that industry and logistics decide modern war. Great battles like Stalingrad, Normandy, or the Ardennes are celebrated in history books. Yet behind them stood staggering numbers of production. Without 96,000 American aircraft, without hundreds of thousands of tanks, trucks, and Liberty ships, those campaigns could never have taken place. In the 21st century, that law has not changed. A nation may possess nuclear weapons, advanced technology, or brilliant tactics, but if it lacks the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged conflict, it cannot prevail. The war in Ukraine, the tensions in the Asia-Pacific, and other looming conflicts all demonstrate the same truth. The side with the stronger supply chains, faster production, and longer endurance in logistics will hold the advantage. The second lesson is that illusion is deadlier than bombs. Hitler did not lose for lack of brave soldiers or skilled generals. He lost because he denied the obvious. When Speer placed the figure of 96,000 before him, Hitler brushed it aside with a contemptuous smile. Yet that smile destroyed more lives than any tactical decision, for it kept Germany fighting a war that could never be won, sending millions more to their deaths. Today, leaders and nations too must confront their own undeniable numbers. Climate change, resource depletion, technological dependency, global economic disparity. If they choose denial, as Hitler denied America's industrial might, the price will be just as catastrophic. The third lesson is that true strength lies in the mobilization of an entire society. America did not win through resources alone, but through harnessing the potential of every class. Women entered the factories, immigrants labored on assembly lines, scientists worked tirelessly in laboratories. The arsenal of democracy was no slogan. It was reality, built by millions of hands. Germany, by contrast, relied on forced labor, and the oppressed cannot build lasting strength. The fourth lesson: technology must be tied to mass production. Germany built the Me-262, the world's first jet fighter, years ahead of its rivals. But only a few hundred were produced, too late, too few to alter the course of war. America, by contrast, built the P-51 Mustang, not a technological marvel, but reliable, numerous, and decisive. Tens of thousands filled the skies, reshaping the air war over Europe. In today's world, where technology advances daily, invention alone is not enough. What matters is the ability to scale those inventions. And the final lesson: truth cannot be buried. Albert Speer brought the number 96,000 to Hitler. Hitler denied it. But truth endured, and in the end, it crushed the Third Reich. It is a reminder that in any age, truth may be hidden for a time, but it will return, often at a far greater cost. Looking back today, the figure of 96,000 does more than astonish us with its scale. It forces us to reflect on how society, technology, and industry converge to determine the fate of nations. It reminds us that war is not fought only in trenches, but in factories, stockpiles, and the calculations of engineers and workers. In his later years, Albert Speer admitted, "We did not lose because we lacked courage, but because we fought against an enemy who knew how to turn their entire nation into a single vast factory." That number, 96,000, is something I will never forget. It not only killed Germany, but it killed our blind faith as well. That ultimately is the greatest legacy of the number, a warning across time. That industry, logistics, and truth, together, hold more power than any army. And any nation that forgets this lesson is doomed to repeat the tragedy of Nazi Germany. There are moments in history that need no words. Just a single number is enough to define an entire era. For the Second World War, that number was 96,000, the number of aircraft the United States produced in 1944 alone. It rang out not as a dry statistic, but as a death knell for the Third Reich, and at the same time, as a triumphal hymn for industrial might, for the mobilization power of a democracy in its darkest hour. When Speer laid those production charts before Hitler, the room fell silent for a brief moment. He knew full well, each column, each line of figures was more than data. It was a map of the future, proof that Nazi Germany, with all its military discipline, its ruthlessness, and its technical sophistication, could not defeat an industrial machine roaring half a world away. But that truth was cast aside, dismissed by the blind faith of a dictator. From there, the tragedy deepened. German cities burned under relentless bombardment. Armies were sent to the front knowing they could not change the outcome. And America's assembly lines kept running, day and night, producing another airplane, another ship, another cog in the machinery of victory with every passing hour. What makes the number 96,000 so haunting is not only its scale, but its contrast. On one side, America, where workers, engineers, women, and immigrants joined hands to transform the nation into an arsenal of democracy. On the other, Germany, relying on forced labor, where prisoners toiled under duress, and where brilliant inventions never had the time or resources to become overwhelming force. In this contrast lies an iron law. Modern war is not only a duel of guns, but a duel of factories. Not only who shoots better, but who produces more. Not only who fights bravely, but who sustains logistics longer. And in 1944, when America unleashed 96,000 aircraft, that law was revealed in full. But if the story ended there, it would remain only history. Its real value lies elsewhere, in how it speaks to the present, to the world we now inhabit. The 21st century, too, has its defining numbers: gigawatts of renewable energy, semiconductor output, steel tonnage, drone production capacity. These figures, seemingly dry, are matters of survival, just as 96,000 once was. Whoever controls them, whoever harnesses them, will shape the balance of global power. And here we once again see the shadow of Speer, not as Hitler's armaments minister, but as the image of modern experts, advisors, analysts. They bring charts and figures to today's leaders. They warn that the adversary is producing more, faster, and with greater resilience. The question remains, will leaders listen, or will they dismiss the truth as Hitler once did? If they listen, they may adapt, prepare, and avoid disaster. If they deny, they will repeat the old tragedy, illusion crushing truth, and millions paying the price for one leader's blindness. The number 96,000 carries yet another meaning, a human one. It reminds us that behind every machine, every assembly line, stand people. American workers, many who had never left their hometowns, hammered rivets, welded steel, tightened bolts to build those planes. They never stormed Normandy or Iwo Jima with rifles, but without them, those battles could never have been fought. They were the unsung heroes who won with sweat instead of blood. This truth highlights a paradox. While historians often write of generals and battles, sometimes it is the industrial numbers that rewrite history. World War II had Montgomery, Patton, Zhukov. But it also had 96,000, a silent figure, faceless and nameless, yet decisive in shaping the fate of the world. And that is why its echo still lingers today. Whenever the world stands at the brink of conflict, whenever strategists speak of a quick victory, we should remember Speer, remember Hitler, remember the production chart that was ignored. And we should remember, if one side produces 10 times more than the other, courage, tactics, or miracle weapons may delay the end, but they cannot reverse it. In today's globalized world, industrial strength no longer lies in a single nation. It lies in supply chains, in cross-border networks. Any major war will not only be a clash of armies, but a contest over who controls the economic lifelines: energy, chips, data, food. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy is not America's greatness, nor Germany's downfall, but the power of truth itself. The number 96,000 existed, whether Hitler believed it or not. It was like a law of physics, immune to speeches or willpower, and in the end, truth crushed illusion, as surely as steel gears grind down a fragile machine. That is the echo of 96,000 hours, a cold reminder that in both history and the present, truth and industry endure, while illusion and arrogance lead only to ruin.